Thank you very much, Thomas Piketty, for your very insightful presentation. And we will start the roundtable. We'll give the floor to Lisa Herzog. So please, Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for this great invitation. And I've very much enjoyed listening to Thomas' talk. And I share this general view that we need to be optimistic, maybe not just because of how we look at the world, but also as a moral question. I think it's a moral imperative to be optimistic because we need to keep thinking about how improvements can happen. Our so-called liberal societies, however you define it, seem to be very good when it comes to technical innovation. And one data point on this that I find really striking is when you think about what happened in the last couple of years about the corona vaccines, the speed with which this technical and biomedical innovation was made was just breathtaking. I mean, it's fantastic how quickly this happened, based on previous research, of course, based on partly publicly, partly privately funded endeavors. But then what we also saw was that social innovation was actually lagging quite behind in at least two senses. One was that we obviously failed to build the kind of trust in institutions such that all people would be willing to actually take these vaccines. And maybe even worse, we've seen a total failure to make these medical innovations accessible to people around the world. And I often think that many of the challenges of climate change, which Jamal also mentioned, they are at least as much a question of social innovations, changes in institutions, changes in social norms, as they are technical problems. Lots of the technical solutions are there, but the social resistance, the political lack of will, the economic resistance, all of that is keeping us back. So what I want to focus on in my brief commentary here is how societies can get better at learning when it comes to social innovation. And I here want to really resist the model of a kind of technocratic elite bringing blessings to the rest of the population. That would be quite questionable with regard to its democratic character, and it would be probably quite illiberal. But it's also really questionable whether it would work, because for many reforms, in the end, you need them to be accepted by the whole population. So what we should look for instead are societies in which there are really society-wide processes of learning and feedback that can come from all members of society. So I'm here thinking about the tradition of John Stuart Mill, for example, who spoke about experiments in living, or John Dewey, who spoke about the experimental method as a key for social progress. And he also mentioned social scientists having a specific role to articulate the problems of the public. But in the end, it's very much a view where all members of society need to be enabled to participate in innovation. And that's also something that the feminist tradition has always emphasized. In the tradition of feminist activism, you have a long tradition of asking what kind of social innovations can work, how can we learn from others? And I think that is an element of the left liberal tradition that we really need to think about today because of the urgent challenges in our societies. So if you see ourselves as heirs to that tradition, what makes it possible to have democratic learning processes? And I'll focus on the 3 points here. I agree with the need for more equality, but I don't think it's the only thing. But I think that more equality would help bring about more of the other conditions that I think need to be in place. The first is what I call epistemic infrastructures for democracies. And by epistemic, philosophers mean related to knowledge production, of course. So the questions concerning the way of accessing relevant information, finding others who might know something about a specific topic, finding relevant experts, bringing people together who can solve problems together. That's what I mean by epistemic infrastructures. And many of them are public institutions. They can also be private institutions. But what has happened in recent decades has been that these epistemic infrastructures have been quite threatened and partly undermined by a certain kind of free market thinking, according to which the free market is always the best machine for dealing with, to quote Hayek, the use of knowledge in society. And I think that is highly dangerous, because it then also went hand in hand historically, even though Hayek was much more nuanced about this, with ideas about minimizing state interference in the public provision of certain goods, and the idea the taxes should be as low as possible, as Thomas already discussed. And that has raised real questions about these epistemic infrastructures of democracy. And Thomas talked about education, which is of course one element here, but there are also broader questions about media, the role of universities. What task do they give themselves? Are they driven by indicators and numbers and how many patents they put down, or is it really an understanding of universities also serving the democratic public? And if you have democratic experiments going on, of course, people need to learn about them, hear about them. If some people have great ideas and they just remain limited to their local context, then learning cannot take place. And some of these great experiments in living may actually take place, but no one hears about it, and you don't have feedback loops, and you don't have further learning processes building on them. So I think that's a first condition. A second is a very basic one, but I think still one that we really need to ask ourselves, okay, how are we actually going to ensure this? And that is very basically that there needs to be time and space and energy in people's lives to engage in social experimentation of various kinds. And that can mean that they regularly participate in a social movement or an activist group, or it can mean that they get time off from work to participate in certain projects. But the problem that we see today is that only the most privileged members of our societies can actually afford to do this. Individuals who need 2 jobs to make ends meet, and they struggle to organize childcare and so on, they will simply be too exhausted for any such endeavors. And the more you exhaust people, the more they will just obey orders and really become subjects and not active citizens. And even individuals who could, in principle, financially afford to participate in processes of social innovation might also not do it if they are caught in a kind of rat race with regard to income and wealth that they maybe misunderstand in some meritocratic sense, that they need to keep up with the Jones, focus all their energies on their jobs, which also makes them all the more exploitable by their employers. That is an understanding of what work and careers are all about that makes it very difficult to square with the need to also be a citizen and to participate in processes of social innovation. So if the economic system keeps individuals too busy and too exhausted, they will be reduced, or they will reduce themselves really to bourgeois and not citoyen, to use Rousseau's contrast. And then we cannot expect democratic experimentation from them. The third point is one that Thomas Piketty already mentioned, the issue of workplace democracy. That has many dimensions. It has to do with power sharing, it has to do with the distribution of income. But I here want to focus on a participatory dimension of workplace democracy and the kinds of social habits and skills that it can ideally breed in people. That wouldn't matter so much if we maybe just work 15 hours a week, as John Maynard Keynes had predicted for our generation, but obviously we are not there yet. And given that people spend so much time in their jobs, there's a real question about what kind of mindset, what kind of skills, what kind of attitudes their jobs create. And if that's just attitudes of receiving orders and doing as much or as little as you can get away with, but not taking initiative, not taking responsibility for improving things, then the workplaces are sort of driving out, crowding out the attitudes that people would need as good democratic citizens in order to engage in the processes that can lead to social learning and social innovation. So to summarize, I really share this optimistic view in the sense that we have no chance but to keep trying to reduce inequality, to reduce exclusion, sexism, racism, classism, and to also drive out harmful ideologies such as a certain understanding of meritocracy that are really in deep tension with democratic learning and democratic experimentation. But at the same time, we really need to focus on the conditions of the possibility, sort of transcendental argument, Kant would have said, of everyone participating in such experimentation. But my first book in German was called Freedom is Not Just for the Rich. And I think the freedom to participate in such experiments and to really be an active citizen is at the moment very much limited to the more privileged members of society. And that is illiberal, but also dysfunctional. And that's something that really needs to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa Herzog, for your comments and the discussion. Thomas Piketty, would you like to answer first Lisa Herzog comments, or would you like to hear to Shigeki Uno's comments?
Maybe it's better if we move to the next discussion, and I'd be happy to answer them all. But basically, I agree, and I've learned a lot from Lisa's work, and yeah, I think it's better to postpone the discussion after the next discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. So I give the floor to Shigeki Uno. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm so pleased to be able to participate in the opening session of this symposium with Professor Thomas Piketty and Professor Lisa Herzog. The theme of the symposium is the future of liberalism, and it is organized by Research Institution on Japanese Studies. Therefore, I would like to make some comments on the presentation by Professor Piketty, and at the same time, I'd like to talk a little about Japanese liberalism, or liberalism in Japan. First and foremost, I would like to express my sincere sympathy for Professor Piketty's optimism or the conviction that the equality of humankind will advance despite various difficulties. I'm a researcher in the history of political thought, and I started my academic career from the study of the French political thinker, Alexis de Tocqueville. The most important message of Tocqueville is, in his Democracy in America, is equality is the irreversible future of humankind. It is difficult to judge whether the human beings that Tocqueville had in his mind at the time included non-Christian people, including Asian or African countries, but I'm convinced that Tocqueville's prophecy is meaningful to all human beings. In order to enhance equality and fair development of the world, we must fight still remaining disparities in the world. In doing so, I'd like to express my full agreement that Professor Piketty's idea of participatory socialism. I've read your book, another book, Vivement le Socialisme. I like this book. This book is a collection of the essays written by Professor Piketty for Le Monde. And in this book, Professor Piketty makes much stress on the idea of participatory socialism. So I would like to express my agreement for Professor Piketty's idea of participatory socialism. However, I would explain later, I personally want to use the term social liberalism. And Professor Piketty argues that the essence of inequality is ideological and political. If that is correct, there's something to consider when tackling the issue of equality and inequality in Japan. It is a question of how Japanese think about freedom and equality today. I'm also a director of NIRA, Nippon Institute for Research Advancement. So I'd like to show the result of this NIRA survey on Japanese values. So I'd like to share the screen. Yes. Please see the figure 1. According to this survey, the overwhelming majority of the respondents choose freedom when asked whether they choose freedom or equality. Our simple question is, do Japanese love freedom so much? Or rather, it should be understood that this result shows the decline of the value of equality for the Japanese people, or at least some skepticism of its realization. By the way, this survey is conducted twice for the same subject. Between the first and the second times, we asked the respondents to read the comments of the experts. One expert comment is libertarianism, and the other one is Rawlsian emphasis on equal liberty. As a result, the number of neutral or I can't say either, increased in the second survey. Apparently, the Japanese way of thinking is neither libertarian nor Rawlsian. Next, figure 2. Although this survey was conducted in September 2021, many respondents supporting limiting individual freedom in order to prevent spread of COVID-19. In Europe, there was much debate about limiting individual freedom of action and movement during the lockdown. However, as far as this survey is concerned, many Japanese appear to be tolerant of the restriction of personal freedom. If so, what is the freedom that many Japanese people prefer? It is freedom that is compatible with regulation. Do people think that if someone does what they want without any regulation, not only their health, but also their freedom will be threatened? Also, I'd like to see the result of the survey on government service. Please look at the figure 3. According to the survey, many of the respondents who chose freedom favored simplified government. This is to some extent as expected. Surprisingly, on the other hand, many of the respondents who chose equality also favored simplified government. It is true that relatively many respondents who chose equality favored full-range government service, but nonetheless, more people chose a simplified government. That is to say, equality-loving people in Japan prefer simplified rather than full-range government service. It's quite surprising for me. It is, of course, difficult to draw conclusions from this survey alone, but it seems that the background of the respondents' opinion is doubt about the fairness of government services. They may be distrust that no matter how much tax they pay, it may not lead to the enhancement of the services to themselves. Achieving desirable social justice is difficult without trust in government, but it is serious if low support for equality is linked to the distrust of the government in reducing equality. Finally, I'd like to give my interpretation about this NIRA survey. Of course, this is just my personal hypothesis and not the only interpretation. First, I am skeptical of the conclusion that Japanese people choose freedom over equality. Rather, the result of the survey suggests that government failure to adequately address the issue of inequality may have led to low expectation for realization of equality. I think such low and pessimistic expectation for the realization of equality in Japan have led to the expansion of neoliberal values. We must once again rebuild the idea of equality, and we need to regain confidence in the government. Secondly, the freedom that Japanese prefer is not libertarian, but freedom that allows for restriction of freedom for some public reason. In a sense, it is an idea of freedom that is harmony with order and social consensus. However, I would like to understand this not as communitarian freedom, but an idea of freedom that emphasizes respect for others and reciprocity. I think that what is needed in contemporary Japan is liberalism. However, that liberalism wouldn't be neoliberal or libertarian. I think it is social liberalism that puts emphasis on social justice and respect for others. The social liberalism that is supported by equality of property, by progressive taxation, and universalist social security. Third, in order to revitalize such social liberalism, it is essential to revitalize democracy. As Professor Piketty has stressed, I believe that the social liberalism supported by the revitalization of democracy is not so much from the participatory socialism by Professor Piketty. So I'd like to know about the interpretation of Professor Piketty's about the liberalism, and especially social liberalism, and the difference between the social liberalism and participatory socialism, stressed by, said by Professor Piketty. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Uno, for your comments and question. So I now give the floor to Thomas Piketty. You will answer maybe first Lisa Herzog and then Professor Uno, or whatever, the order, what you prefer.
Yeah, so maybe let me answer to both by saying that what I put under the label of participatory socialism is basically, in my view, this is really the continuation of this movement toward more political, economic, social equality that has already taken place over the past 2 centuries, and in particular the continuation of the social democratic agenda of the 20th century. The continuation in a number of directions, including more equal political power in the electoral process, through much tighter control of the financing of political campaigns, the financing of the media with egalitarian democratic vouchers to finance both political campaign and the media, which I think is absolutely critical. More equal voting rights in terms of economic democracy. So as I said, one of the achievements of social democracy, particularly in Germany, Sweden in the 20th century, was to grant as much as 50% of voting rights in the boards of large corporations, which is quite a significant change as compared to traditional capitalist liberal rules where the only shareholders have voting rights. So of course in the German system, shareholders still have 50% plus 1 of the vote, but if the workers, in addition to the 50% of voting rights that they already have, just as workers also have 10 or 20% of the shares of the company, or if a local government has 10 or 20% of the shares of the company, then this can shift the majority, even as compared to a shareholder who has 80 or 90% of the shares of the company. And I can tell you from the point of view of a shareholder in France or US or UK or probably in Japan, this looks like communism. And when this was instituted in Germany in 1952 and reinforced in 1976, this was heavily, criticized, of course, by liberal circles and shareholders. But in the end, this allowed for more involvement of workers in the long-run strategy of company. And I think we should go much further. So what I put in participatory socialism, is an extension of this system to all countries, all companies, small and large, with 50% of the seat with workers. And together with this, a maximum share of the vote among the 50% going to shareholders, say not more than 5 or 10% of the share for a single shareholder in a company with more than 100 workers. And then you can adjust the exact rules, but that's the general idea. So what I put under the label of participatory socialism in this movement, in effect, toward more democracy, both in the electoral sphere, political sphere, and in companies. This together has to come with more redistribution of wealth, so very progressive taxation, not only of income, but also of wealth and inheritance, so as to redistribute wealth itself, and a much more ambitious definition of educational justice, as I have illustrated. Now, if you want to call this social liberalism, as long as the content is the same, I'm not here to do, the police of words and to say, which word should be used. In my country, in France, or I think in most European countries, social liberalism refers to a much less ambitious redistributive platform than what I've just described. And, in fact, social liberalism is used by political parties and political groups who don't want progressive taxation at all, want to get rid of progressive wealth tax, certainly don't want more workers' rights corporation. In France, we happen to have a legislative election in a few days, and the political coalition that's pushing for more voting rights for workers in companies and more progressive wealth tax is probably, as you've noticed, is not the coalition that's usually described itself as working under the principle of social liberalism, which is the government now in power. But that's a particular way to use these words that is specific to a given country at a given point in time. That's very interesting, but we should not put too much emphasis on this. I can easily imagine that these words are used differently in a Japanese context, and of course in a US context, the word liberalism is used very differently. So I still think that the word socialism has some meaning, and that democratic socialism, participatory socialism, to me remains the clearer manner to describe this economic system that I'm referring to, where basically the power of money and the power of shareholders will be so heavily restricted as compared to standard economic liberalism and standard capitalist rules, that in effect this will be moving toward a different economic system, which we already have started to do, in the sense that today's capitalist system is so different from the capitalism of 1910. I described the structure of power in Sweden 1910, both in elections and in corporations and in education. So what I'm putting under the label of participatory socialism, of course, it's quite different from the economic system and political system and social system that we have today. But I would say, it's not more different from the system we have today than the system we have today is different from the capitalism of 1910. So, in the long run evolution of things, that's very much in the continuation. Now, maybe just answering to Lisa, how do we get there? And how we do have the kind of mobilization that moves us in this direction. Well, again, I'm trying to start from the lessons of the 20th century and the 19th century, and I think we need collective organization. We social sciences and books and this kind of discussion can be very useful, of course, but that's of course not going to be sufficient. And at the end of the day, this has to do with political power, balance of power, and you need collective organization, political parties, new forms of workers, trade union organization, which of course would be very different from the form of organization we had in the 20th century, because means of communication, everything has changed a lot. But in the end, we need to imagine, new forms of organization, building political platforms of transformation that will push in this direction. And, I think this will take a long time, because in the long run, if we take a long run view on this, I think we are still very much in the sort of post-communist era of, lots of skepticism about the possibility of moving again toward a more positive, egalitarian transformation of the economic system. It will take time. Of course, the 2008 financial crisis and then the pandemic and the Ukraine war, etc., has started to move us away from the sort of neoliberal moment of the 1990s, early 2000, where everybody, or at least many people, believe that free markets, free competition was going to solve everything. So now people are a bit, but there is a temptation to replace neoliberalism by sort of neo-nationalism, which is, of course, the simplest way to address the problem that each country has to address. You can, basically you blame others, you blame other countries, and you magnify your own nation state. That's in the United States. We are done with Trump for the time being, but we don't know for how long with this kind of political mobilization. But I just want to say, this, what made Trump possible was also, the failure of Reaganism in a way. Reaganism was promising more prosperity for all, you know, through tax cuts for the rich, etc. And you know, people in the US did not see that. You know, they had stagnating wages. So you know, 3 decades after Reagan, you know, the Republican Party had to move toward neo-nationalism in a way, because you know the idea was to tell the public opinion, well, you know, you didn't see the prosperity that we had told you about because, you know, Mexican workers, China, Muslim migrants, the rest of the world, Europe is not paying for their defense. You know, basically it's the fault of the rest of the world who have been stealing the hard work of Americans. And so, you know, this kind of neo-nationalist movement, unfortunately, is that's not going to solve the social, environmental, economic problem we have to solve, but it's so much simpler a political message than, you know, starting to say, you know, look at the history of progressive taxation in the 20th century, you know, it worked very well, look at my graph. But, you know, if I do that with Donald Trump, you know, I think he will have stopped listening a long time ago. And now, of course, this is not a reason to all go down to the level of Donald Trump, but it's difficult. And if you don't have, you know, intermediation through broad-based political organization, political parties, trade unions that sort of help citizens to appropriate for themselves, you know, the set of transformation. This is this is a very complicated process, and you know, we as social scientists and philosophers, you know, have a role to play in this process. But at the same time, we have to be modest, of course, of you know, how much we can bring.